My fingers were numb, locked around the titanium frame of my camera tripod. I was supposed to be photographing a rare alpine eagle, not freezing on a desolate ridge. The wind whipped my hair across my face, blinding me. When it cleared, I wasn't alone. He hadn't made a sound. He just stood there, a towering, unbothered wall of muscle in a dark coat, staring at me with eyes that could cut glass. "You are trespassing," he stated, his voice a flat, terrifying baritone. Panic clawed at my throat. Naturally, I resorted to sarcasm. "Well, if you're going to stand there looking terrifying, at least warm me up." His eyes flashed. "Be careful what you ask for." He stepped forward. My survival response bypassed my brain entirely. I swung the heavy tripod with everything I had, aiming directly for his jaw. I expected a satisfying crack. Instead, an impossibly large hand clamped around the metal pole mid-swing, stopping it completely. Before I could even gasp or scream, he yanked the weapon away, stepped into my space, and effortlessly hauled me over his broad shoulder. "We are going for a walk," he declared to the howling wind.
Welcome back, Wolfpack. Today we are trading dark angst for high-stakes hilarity. Get ready for a laugh-out-loud, slow-burn battle of wills packed with extreme forced proximity and sarcastic banter. Grab your coziest blanket, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a new romance, and let's dive straight into our brand new story, Warm Me Up.
Chapter 1. "Put me down," I yelled, my voice swallowed by the howling wind. He didn't break his stride. The ground passed in a dizzying blur of white snow and gray rock. I was slung over his shoulder like a sack of incredibly annoyed flour, bouncing with every silent, heavy step he took. "I have rights," I tried again, kicking my heavy hiking boots. "I have a lawyer. Well, I have a cousin who watched a lot of legal dramas, which is basically the same thing." He stopped abruptly. I braced for an impact, but he merely shifted his grip, grabbed me by the waist, and set me down in the snow with infuriating ease. Before I could scramble away, he plucked my titanium tripod from the drift where it had fallen, collapsed it with a sharp click, and tucked it under his arm. "Walk," he commanded. "Where?" I demanded, crossing my arms to trap what little warmth I had left. "You can't just abduct people in the middle of a national park." "This is not a park," he replied, already turning his back on me and heading down the treacherous slope. "And you are trespassing. Keep up, or you will freeze." I wanted to run the other way out of pure spite, but the icy wind bit through my jacket, making my teeth chatter. I had zero sense of direction, no weapon, and my kidnapper was currently power-walking through a blizzard like he was on a leisurely Sunday stroll. "Fine," I shouted, plunging my boots into the knee-deep snow to follow him. "But if I die of hypothermia, I am haunting you. I'll be an incredibly annoying ghost. I'll hide your keys. I'll change your Wi-Fi password." A low, rumbling noise escaped his chest. It sounded suspiciously like a sigh. For the next hour, my life devolved into a grueling, torturous cardio session. The descent was steep, the air was thin, and my calves were actively burning. I tripped over hidden roots, slid on slick patches of ice, and cursed his entire bloodline. He navigated the brutal terrain without a single misstep, never slipping, never breathing hard. It was unnatural. "Could you slow down?" I gasped, leaning heavily against a frosted pine tree. "Are you secretly part mountain goat? Because this is ridiculous." He paused, glancing back at me with an unreadable expression. "You requested warmth. Movement generates heat." I stared at him, my lungs burning. "That was a joke? You took that literally? What is wrong with you?" He didn't bother answering, turning and resuming his effortless, silent descent. I groaned, peeling myself off the tree and trudging after him. I was too exhausted to maintain my defensive chatter, forced to focus solely on putting one frozen foot in front of the other. Eventually, the relentless whiteout began to thin. The howling wind dropped to a manageable breeze, and the scent of wood smoke cut through the crisp mountain air. We stepped out of the tree line, and I stumbled to a halt. Nestled in the valley below was a sprawling, bustling logging town. Enormous trucks rumbled past, and massive, broad-shouldered lumberjacks were hauling timber with terrifying ease. I turned to my kidnapper, planning to demand a phone. But as we approached the main road, the nearest group of hulking loggers stopped dead in their tracks. They didn't yell. They didn't ask who I was. In total silence, every single massive man bowed his head in deep, terrified reverence to the stoic man standing beside me. Chapter 2. I stopped breathing entirely. The silence in the street was absolute, broken only by the sharp, biting wind sweeping through the valley. These were not small men. They wore heavy flannel, steel-toed boots and suspenders over chests the size of industrial refrigerators. And yet every single one of them was staring at the snow-covered pavement, their postures rigid with terrifying respect. I swallowed hard, turning my head slowly to look at the man beside me. He didn't acknowledge them. He didn't wave, nod, or even break his stride. He simply kept walking, expecting the path to clear. And it did. The massive loggers practically shoved each other out of the way to ensure he had a wide berth. "Okay," I whispered, my voice incredibly small. "Who exactly did I just hit with a tripod?" "Keep walking," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that I felt in my chest more than I heard. He steered me by the elbow, his grip completely inescapable but surprisingly gentle, guiding me toward a squat, brightly lit building at the end of the dirt road. The neon sign above the door flickered, buzzing with a faint, electrical hum, spelling out Valley Diner. When he pushed the heavy wooden door open, a bell chimed above our heads. The smell hit me first: grease, strong black coffee, and frying bacon. My stomach gave a loud, violent rumble, completely betraying my dignified hostage persona. The diner was packed. The clatter of silverware and the roar of boisterous conversation filled the space, right up until the moment we stepped inside. Instantly, the noise died. It was as if someone had pulled a plug on the room's audio. Forks halted halfway to open mouths. A waitress froze mid-pour, coffee overflowing a porcelain mug and splashing onto the linoleum counter. "Sit," my captor instructed, nodding toward a corner booth. I scrambled into the worn vinyl seat, sliding all the way to the window. I pulled my knees to my chest, defensively clutching my camera bag to my sternum like a bulletproof vest. He didn't sit across from me. Instead, he walked toward the counter, speaking in a low, hushed tone to the pale, trembling cook. I took the opportunity to study him. He was tall, absurdly so, with broad shoulders that seemed to take up all the oxygen in the room. His dark coat was damp from the snow, but he looked completely unbothered by the freezing temperatures we had just survived. There was a dangerous, coiled energy to him, a predatory stillness that made my anxiety spike into the red zone. He turned around, carrying 2 massive ceramic mugs. I immediately looked down, pretending to be utterly fascinated by the sticky, laminated menu wedged between the salt and pepper shakers. I didn't hear him walk back. I didn't hear his boots on the hardwood floor or the rustle of his coat. Suddenly, a massive hand placed a steaming mug of tea directly beside my elbow. I shrieked, my fight-or-flight instincts hijacking my brain. I snatched the heavy, laminated menu off the table and swung it backward, slapping him squarely in the center of his solid chest with a loud thwack. The entire diner gasped in unison. I froze, the menu still pressed against his sternum. He looked down at the laminated plastic, then slowly raised his dark, intense eyes to meet mine. "Did you just hit me with the breakfast specials?" he asked, his voice entirely devoid of amusement. "You sneak up on people," I squeaked, dropping the menu as if it were on fire. "You're a giant. You should make giant noises. Stomp. Clear your throat. Wear a bell." He slowly slid into the booth across from me, his immense frame making the table seem laughably small. "You have terrible reflexes." "I have survival instincts," I snapped back, wrapping my freezing hands around the hot mug of tea. The warmth seeped into my numb fingers, and I let out a pathetic, shaky sigh. "Look, Mr. Whoever you are, I'm just a wildlife photographer. I was tracking an eagle. I didn't see any no trespassing signs, If you let me go, I will pretend this entire terrifying hike never happened. A waitress practically teleported to our table, dropping a massive plate of eggs, toast, and bacon in front of me before vanishing just as quickly. "Eat," he ordered, leaning back against the vinyl seat. He crossed his arms, watching me with a pragmatic, calculating stare. "You are not going anywhere." "Excuse me?" I bristled, my fork halting over the eggs. "You can't keep me here. I have a return flight on Tuesday." "Cancel it," he replied smoothly. "You were found on a restricted ridge, carrying high-grade surveillance equipment. Until my security team verifies your identity and ensures you are not corporate espionage, you remain in my custody." "Your custody?" I barked out a harsh, hysterical laugh. "Are you the police? The military? The king of the mountain?" He didn't blink. "Something like that?" I stared at him, my appetite suddenly vanishing. "You're joking." "I never joke," he stated flatly. He reached into his dark coat, retrieving a heavy, matte black communication device, tapping the screen with a large thumb. "I have booked our transport. We leave for my central estate in 20 minutes. Finish your eggs." Chapter 3. The high-altitude sleeper train was a monstrous machine of riveted steel and frosted glass, hissing steam onto the icy platform. The mechanical roar of the engine vibrated through the soles of my boots as my captor, who had finally introduced himself simply as Gideon, marched me toward the boarding steps. "I don't even have my toothbrush," I muttered bitterly, struggling to keep pace with his long strides. "Or clean socks. Do you know how quickly wool socks lose their structural integrity? It's a logistical nightmare." Gideon ignored my rambling, flashing a digital credential to the terrified conductor, who immediately bowed and scrambled out of our way. We moved down the narrow, dimly lit corridor of the sleeper car. The air smelled of ozone and polished brass. He stopped in front of cabin 4, swiping a keycard. The heavy metal door slid open with a pneumatic hiss. I stepped inside and instantly dropped my camera bag. The cabin was luxurious, paneled in dark wood with velvet curtains, but that wasn't the problem. The problem was the bed. Specifically, the singular, albeit plush mattress occupying the center of the room. "Absolutely not," I declared, taking a firm step backward. "Nope. This is a severe violation of my boundaries. I am not sharing a bed with my kidnapper." Gideon's jaw tightened. He stepped past me, his massive shoulders brushing against mine in the cramped space, and keyed the intercom on the wall. "Conductor, there has been an error. I require a second cabin." I apologize, sir." The panicked voice crackled through the speaker. "The winter storm grounded the regional flights. Every cabin is fully booked. We have absolutely zero vacancy. I am so sorry." Gideon cut the connection, pinching the bridge of his nose. For the first time, he looked genuinely exhausted, the harsh overhead light catching the deep, dark circles under his eyes. "Fine," he gritted out, turning to face me. "I will take the chair." "That chair is decorative," I pointed out, gesturing to the tiny velvet armchair bolted to the corner. "You're the size of a commercial refrigerator. You'll break it, and then I'll be charged for damages." "I am paying for the damages," he snapped, his stoic composure finally showing a hairline fracture. "Just stay on your side." He unbuttoned his heavy coat, shrugging it off to reveal a fitted black Henley that did absolutely nothing to hide the ridiculous muscular width of his chest. He tossed the coat over the tiny chair and sat down, looking impossibly uncomfortable. I swallowed hard, my heart hammering against my ribs. The cabin was entirely too small. I could smell the crisp pine and snow scent of him mixing with the warm, metallic air of the train. The proximity was suffocating. My anxiety spiked, demanding action. If I couldn't control the situation, I would control my environment. I unzipped my duffel bag and began pulling out every piece of equipment I owned. "What are you doing?" Gideon asked, his voice low and incredibly strained. "Establishing a perimeter," I replied, grabbing a massive telephoto lens case and slamming it onto the exact center of the mattress. I followed it up with my spare camera body, a tangle of charging cables, and finally, my collapsed titanium tripod. I grabbed 3 plush pillows from the headboard and aggressively shoved them between the equipment, building a literal waist-high fortress down the middle of the bed. "There," I announced, pointing a trembling finger at the barricade. "That is the demilitarized zone. You do not cross it. If you cross it, I will scream. I will also bite. I have all my shots." Gideon stared at the pillow fort, then slowly dragged his gaze up to my face. He looked profoundly tired, as if dealing with me was draining his life force in real time. "You are completely exhausting." "It's a defensive mechanism," I shot back, kicking off my boots and aggressively crawling onto my designated sliver of the mattress. I pulled the heavy wool blanket up to my chin, refusing to look at him. "And you're the one who kidnapped me. Deal with it." The train gave a sudden, mighty lurch as it began to pull away from the station. The rhythmic clack-clack of the wheels over the tracks vibrated through the mattress. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing my racing heart to slow down. The tension in the tiny room was thick enough to chew. Minutes ticked by in heavy, suffocating silence. Suddenly, the train hit a sharp, violent curve on the mountain pass. The entire cabin tilted sideways. Physics betrayed me. With a yelp, I rolled right over my carefully constructed pillow barricade, tumbling off the mattress and flying directly into the dark. I braced for the harsh impact of the wooden floor, but it never came. Instead, I crashed against a solid wall of heat and muscle. 2 massive arms clamped around my waist in the pitch black, absorbing my fall with terrifying ease. My hands flew out, pressing flat against Gideon's chest. I could feel the rapid, heavy thumping of his heart beneath the thin fabric of his shirt. He was incredibly warm, radiating a fierce, intense heat that completely combated the drafty chill of the train car. I didn't cross the demilitarized zone," I blurted out, my voice breathless and practically squeaking. "The zone aggressively relocated me." He didn't let go. His hands remained firmly locked around my waist, keeping me completely steady as the train righted itself. His face was only inches from mine, his breathing slow and measured, though the grip on my hips suggested he was far more tense than he let on. "Are you injured?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that sent a highly inappropriate shiver down my spine. "No," I managed to say, though my brain was currently short-circuiting. I pushed against his chest, scrambling backward until my back hit the edge of the mattress. Gideon slowly released me, leaning back into his absurdly small chair. The moonlight streaming through the frosted window illuminated the sharp angles of his jaw and the exhausted slump of his shoulders. "You can take the bed," I offered quietly, suddenly feeling incredibly guilty. "I can sit in the chair." "No," he replied flatly. "Go to sleep." "I can't sleep," I admitted, pulling my knees to my chest. The sarcasm had completely drained out of me, leaving nothing but the raw, nervous truth. I don't sleep well in strange places, or at all, really. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. The rhythmic clattering of the train filled the silence. "Neither do I," he finally confessed, his voice lacking its usual commanding edge. It sounded rough, worn down to the bone. I looked at him, really looked at him, past the terrifying size and the imposing coat. "Why not?" He rubbed the back of his neck, staring out the dark window at the blur of snowy pines. "Because if I close my eyes, the logistics pile up. The border disputes, the trade agreements, the safety of thousands of people. It does not stop. It never stops." The absolute weight of his admission hung in the air. He wasn't just a controlling kidnapper, he was a man drowning under an ocean of responsibility, holding his breath just to survive. "Well," I said softly, resting my chin on my knees, "for what it's worth. You're currently dealing with a very annoying photographer who builds pillow forts. You can probably put the border disputes on pause for one night." A faint, breathy sound escaped his lips. A chuckle. The sound was so entirely unexpected that it completely rewired my understanding of him. We stayed awake the rest of the night, not speaking, just listening to the train and sharing the dark. It was the most intimate silence I had ever experienced. When the sun finally rose, the blinding white mountains had vanished. I peered out the window, blinking against the harsh morning light. We were descending into a lush, sun-drenched valley. The air inside the cabin immediately felt warmer, thicker. "We are here," Gideon announced, standing up and rolling his shoulders. The vulnerable man from the dark was gone, replaced instantly by the stoic, pragmatic leader. We disembarked onto a bustling, sunlit train platform. The climate change was jarring. I had to immediately strip off my heavy winter jacket, tying it around my waist. The station was chaotic, filled with people in light clothing, vendors shouting, and the smell of blooming jasmine. I dragged my heavy camera duffel over my shoulder, exhausted and overwhelmed. A young uniformed porter hurried over, flashing a bright smile. "Welcome to the valley, miss. Let me take that heavy bag for you." He reached out, his fingers grazing the strap of my bag. Gideon moved so fast he was a blur. He stepped squarely between me and the porter, his chest expanding. A low, terrifying, utterly primal snarl ripped from his throat, vibrating through the entire platform. The porter staggered back in sheer terror, dropping his clipboard. I stared at Gideon, my jaw dropping. He was glaring at the poor teenager like the boy had just threatened my life, his biological instincts completely hijacking his logic. "Did you—" I gasped, my voice ringing out over the sudden dead silence of the station. "Did you just growl at a teenager over my luggage?" The porter sprinted away so fast he practically left a cartoon dust cloud in his wake. Gideon blinked. He stared at the empty space where the teenager had just been, then looked down at his own hands. The stoic, terrifying Alpha King, the man who effortlessly commanded armies of massive loggers, actually looked completely horrified by his own biology. Gideon started, his voice rough. He cleared his throat, adjusting his dark cuffs with stiff, mechanical precision. "The bag is heavy." He clearly lacked the upper body strength. "He was a child," I hissed, grabbing the strap of my duffel and aggressively yanking it out of his shadow. "You sounded like a rabid junkyard dog. Are you going to bark at the barista if they get my coffee order wrong? Should I keep a spray bottle handy?" "It was a reflex," he muttered, his jaw ticking as a faint dark flush crept up his neck. He refused to meet my eyes, turning sharply toward a sleek black SUV idling at the curb. "Get in the car, Piper." "Oh, so now we're on a first-name basis?" I grumbled, hauling my bags into the leather-scented interior. "Does that mean I get to pick the radio station, or is your wolf going to howl at the pop music?" He slammed the door shut behind me, completely ignoring the question. The drive through the valley was a sensory shock. Gone were the freezing, brutal winds and the towering pines. The air conditioning in the SUV fought against the blinding, tropical sunlight pouring through the tinted windows. The landscape was a lush, vibrant explosion of greenery and blooming bougainvillea, completely alien to the snowy nightmare we had just survived. We pulled through a set of massive wrought iron gates, and the estate finally revealed itself. It wasn't a dark, brooding castle. It was a sprawling, modern compound of pale stone, floor-to-ceiling glass, and warm timber nestled directly into the side of a sun-drenched cliff. It was beautiful, chaotic, and completely overwhelming. Staff members buzzed around the manicured courtyards, carrying tablets and clipboards, shouting over the roar of a distant waterfall. Gideon led me through the echoing grand foyer, his mere presence parting the crowds of busy officials. The sheer scale of his life hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't just in a different zip code. I was entirely out of my depth. My anxiety, which had been simmering beneath my sarcasm, began to boil over. He deposited me in a massive, sunlit suite in the guest wing. The bed was the size of a small island, and the double doors led out to a private balcony overlooking the valley. "My security team will run your credentials," Gideon announced from the doorway, his stoic mask firmly back in place. "Do not leave this wing. Dinner is at 7. "And what if I need something before then?" I challenged, crossing my arms. Like a lawyer or a therapist to discuss your anger management issues? Read a book, he replied dryly, before stepping back and pulling the heavy mahogany door shut. The lock engaged with a loud, definitive click. I stood alone in the center of the massive room, the silence pressing in on me. I looked at the plush, inviting bed, then at the locked door. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. I was trapped in a billionaire's compound with a man who could carry me up a mountain without breaking a sweat. Panic completely hijacked the wheel. I dropped my bag, marched over to an antique solid oak dresser, and dug my heels into the plush rug. With a loud, ungraceful grunt, I began shoving it across the room. It took me 10 minutes of sweating and swearing, but I finally wedged the massive piece of wood directly in front of the door. For good measure, I jammed a heavy velvet chair under the brass doorknob. "Take that, biology," I muttered, brushing the dust off my hands. I woke up the next morning entirely tangled in the high thread count sheets, my heart racing before my eyes even opened. The sun was pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, golden shadows across the room. I sat up quickly, my eyes darting toward the entryway. The dresser was exactly where I left it. The chair was still securely wedged under the knob. My defensive fortress remained completely unbreached. I let out a long, ragged exhale, feeling a tiny, ridiculous surge of triumph. I might be a hostage, but I was a hostage with excellent structural engineering skills. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, stretching my sore calves. Right on cue, heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. They stopped directly in front of my room. I held my breath, waiting for the inevitable knock. I waited for him to jiggle the handle, realize it was barricaded, and politely ask me to remove the furniture like a civilized kidnapper. Instead, the brass doorknob turned. There was a split second of resistance. Then the heavy mahogany door simply swung inward. The solid oak dresser, which had taken every ounce of my body weight to move, skidded backward across the expensive rug with a horrific, screeching tear. The velvet chair violently popped out from under the knob, clattering uselessly to the floor. Gideon stepped through the ruins of my barricade, completely unbothered, effortlessly holding 2 steaming ceramic mugs of coffee. I stared at him, my jaw practically unhinged. He didn't even look out of breath. He was wearing light gray sweatpants and a tight black athletic shirt that clung to every single ridiculous muscle in his chest. He stepped over the toppled chair, glancing down at the heavy dresser with mild, clinical interest. "Your weight distribution is flawed," he observed, his deep voice thick with morning gravel. "If you wanted to create a proper wedge, you should have angled the chair against the floorboards, not the rug. The friction coefficient was completely negligible." "Are you critiquing my barricade?" I gasped, instinctively pulling the duvet up to my chin. "You just plowed through an antique dresser like a bulldozer." "You dragged an antique dresser across a silk rug," he corrected smoothly, walking over to the nightstand and setting down one of the mugs. The rich, bitter scent of dark roast immediately filled the space. "It was entirely unnecessary. I told you I would return." "That is exactly why I moved it," I yelled, gesturing wildly at the door. "To keep you out. You can't just bust through solid oak before I've even brushed my teeth. It's aggressive. It's rude." Gideon took a slow, deliberate sip from his mug, his dark eyes tracking my frantic movements. A faint, infuriating smirk played at the very edge of his mouth. If I wanted to be aggressive, Piper, the door would not still be on its hinges. The absolute quiet confidence in his voice sent a sudden, highly inconvenient jolt of heat straight to my stomach. I hated that he was right. I hated that he smelled like pine and expensive soap. Most of all, I hated that he was looking at me like I was an incredibly amusing puzzle he was just starting to figure out. "Drink your coffee," he ordered, turning toward the ruined doorway. He paused, looking back over his massive shoulder, "and put on gym clothes. If you have enough energy to rearrange my historic furniture, you have enough energy to join me on the training mats." "I don't exercise unless I'm running away from something," I shouted to his retreating back. "Good," his voice echoed down the hall. Then we will have a very productive morning. The estate's private gym was the size of a commercial airplane hangar, smelling sharply of rubber mats, chalk, and exertion. I stood awkwardly on the edge of the blue padded floor, tugging at the hem of my oversized t-shirt. Gideon was waiting in the center of the room. Without his heavy winter coat or his formal tailored jackets, the sheer, imposing width of him was violently distracting. "Take your shoes off," he instructed, effortlessly tossing a pair of padded sparring gloves onto the bench. "I feel like I should remind you," I stalled, slowly unlacing my sneakers, "that my primary combat strategy involves swinging camera equipment and screaming for a manager. I don't know martial arts." "I am aware," Gideon said dryly, stepping onto the mat. "You swing blindly and hope for impact. It is a terrible strategy. Since you currently reside in a territory that requires high situational awareness, I am going to teach you basic biological defense." "Wait." I held up my hands, taking a defensive step backward. "Biological defense? Are you going to teach me how to growl at teenagers?" His jaw twitched. "Step onto the mat, Piper." I cautiously shuffled forward. Before I could even register the movement, Gideon closed the distance between us. He didn't hit me, but he moved with that terrifying silent speed, his hands gently but firmly gripping my shoulders. "Balance," he murmured, his voice suddenly much closer. "Your center of gravity is entirely chaotic. You are leaning away from the threat." "You are the threat," I squeaked, trying to aggressively shrug off his massive hands. "If I were a threat, you would already be on the floor," he countered reasonably. "Try to sweep my leg." "I am not going to sweep your leg. You're basically made of concrete." "Sweep my leg." I sighed loudly, rolling my eyes, and gave his right ankle a half-hearted, awkward kick. It was like kicking a sequoia tree. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he smoothly hooked his heel behind my calf and shifted his weight. Gravity vanished. With a yelp, I went tumbling backward. But before my back could hit the mat, Gideon's arm shot out, catching me flush against his chest. The air rushed out of my lungs. We crashed to the padded floor together, the impact completely absorbed by his arm shielding my spine. The world spun, and when it stopped, I was flat on my back, completely trapped beneath him. The banter died instantly. He was braced above me, his forearms planted on either side of my head. The playful arrogance vanished from his eyes, replaced by a sudden, intense darkness. His chest heaved against mine, the heat rolling off his body no longer just a biological defense against the cold, but a burning, undeniable tension. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. My hands, which had been perfectly ready to shove him away, instead curled nervously into the fabric of his shirt. He stared down at my mouth, his breathing turning shallow and ragged. He lowered his head, the distance between us shrinking to fractions of an inch. I could feel the ghost of his breath against my lips. "Alpha." The sharp, formal voice echoed loudly through the cavernous gym. Gideon froze, a low, frustrated sound tearing from the back of his throat. He slowly turned his head to glare at the gymnasium door. A terrified pack official stood frozen in the entryway, clutching a tablet to his chest like a shield. I apologize for the interruption, Alpha," the official stammered, his eyes darting frantically between the ceiling and the floor. "But the High Council, they are waiting in the boardroom." Gideon closed his eyes, a muscle feathering violently along his jaw. He didn't move off me immediately. For 3 agonizingly long seconds, the heavy, crushing weight of his chest remained pressed against mine, his breathing harsh and ragged in the quiet gym. Then, he pushed himself up with terrifying grace, smoothing his expression into a mask of pure ice as he glared at the doorway. "I will be there in 5 minutes," he barked. The official squeaked, nodded frantically, and vanished. By 7 o'clock, the adrenaline of the sparring mat had worn off, replaced by sheer, stifling dread. The estate's formal dining room was a cavernous space of dark mahogany and glittering crystal chandeliers. The air was thick with the scent of roasted venison, heavy perfumes, and the suffocating pressure of 20 elite pack members staring me down. I was squeezed into a borrowed emerald silk dress, sitting stiffly between a glaring, silver-haired matriarch and Gideon. He was radiating enough intense biological tension to short-circuit the lighting, his broad shoulders completely blocking my peripheral vision. "So," a man with a jagged scar through his eyebrows sneered from across the table, swirling a glass of dark wine. "The human photographer, tell me, how exactly does one survive a blizzard in the high passes with absolutely no survival gear?" "Spite, mostly," I replied instantly, picking up an absurdly heavy silver spoon. "And a deeply ingrained fear of dying before I can clear my browser history." Dead silence blanketed the room. The clinking of silverware stopped. Gideon stiffened beside me, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his linen napkin. Then the man with the scar threw his head back and barked out a massive, booming laugh. "Spite!" the man roared, slapping his palm against the mahogany table. "I like her, Alpha. She's got teeth." Suddenly, the ice broke. The terrifying elites leaned forward, their hostility replaced by predatory curiosity. I leaned into the skid, using my sarcasm as a shield. I mocked the fact that they all looked like they were attending a funeral for a very wealthy enemy, and pointed out that using 4 different forks for one meal was a logistical nightmare. They ate it up. The silver-haired matriarch actually patted my arm, wheezing with laughter. Gideon, however, was absolutely not laughing. With every joke I made, with every breathless chuckle from his inner circle, his posture grew more rigid. The ambient noise of the room seemed to grate on his highly tuned senses. When the scarred man leaned across the table, grinning widely as he offered to personally escort me on a tour of the southern borders, Gideon completely snapped. His crystal water glass suddenly shattered in his grip. The sharp, violent crack echoed through the room. Water and glass shards scattered across the pristine tablecloth. The laughter died instantly. "Dinner is over," Gideon growled, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. Before I could even process the destruction, his large, calloused hand clamped around my wrist. He stood up, hauling me out of my velvet chair, and dragged me out of the dining room while his entire inner circle stared in absolute, terrified silence. He towed me down 3 echoing, dimly lit corridors before my shock finally wore off. "Let go of me," I snapped, digging my heels into the plush carpet and wrenching my arm out of his iron grip. Gideon spun around, his chest heaving, his dark eyes entirely feral. He looked like a man barely holding onto a frayed rope. My chest tightened with sudden, overwhelming panic. Not because I was afraid he would hurt me, but because I was terrified of how much I actually liked being dragged away by him. My fierce independence was crumbling, and my flight response screamed at me to rebuild the wall. "Okay, Mr. King, very dramatic," I said, aggressively smoothing down the front of my silk dress and forcing a cold, professional tone. "But as your temporary guest, and strictly a civilian contractor, I'd appreciate it if you didn't treat me like a misbehaving golden retriever." He blinked, completely thrown by the sudden shift in my demeanor. Contractor?" "Yes. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go scout some flora." I didn't wait for his response. I spun on my heel and practically sprinted down the adjoining hallway, letting the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine guide me until I burst through a set of heavy glass doors. The estate's greenhouse was massive, a sprawling, humid jungle of exotic orchids, towering ferns, and creeping vines. The air was thick and heavy, the only sound the rhythmic dripping of condensation from the glass ceiling. I retreated deep into the foliage, my hands shaking as I pretended to study a massive, carnivorous-looking pitcher plant. I just needed space. I needed to logically dismantle whatever was happening between us. "You are not scouting flora." The deep voice came from directly behind me. I gasped, whirling around. Gideon stood at the end of the narrow dirt path, completely blocking my only exit. The humid air clung to his skin, curling the dark hair at the nape of his neck. He moved forward, his silent, predatory grace terrifyingly amplified in the dense jungle setting. "I'm working," I lied, stepping backward until my spine hit the damp glass of the exterior wall. I'm assessing the lighting. It's terrible, by the way. Very moody. Gideon didn't stop until he was standing mere inches away, boxing me in with his massive frame. He planted one hand on the glass right beside my head, leaning down until his mouth was level with my ear. "Why did you retreat?" he murmured, the low vibration sending a fresh, infuriating wave of heat straight to my stomach. "Because you broke a glass like a toddler throwing a tantrum," I squeaked, aggressively staring at the center of his chest to avoid his intense gaze. "You can't just mandate who I talk to." "I was not mandating," he replied, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "I was preventing myself from throwing my lead general through a window for touching your arm." My breath hitched. I squeezed my eyes shut, desperately trying to cling to my sarcasm. "That is an HR violation." "Piper," he warned, stepping even closer, completely eliminating the space between us. "Stop hiding behind the jokes. Look at me." I kept my eyes squeezed tightly shut, my heart hammering violently against my ribs as his thumb gently brushed the trembling line of my jaw, completely shattering my defenses. I bolted. I ducked under his arm, scrambled down the dirt path, and practically broke the glass door, sprinting back to the safety of the guest wing. He didn't chase me, which somehow made the chaotic swirling in my chest infinitely worse. By 3 a.m, my anxiety had completely mutated into aggressive insomnia. I stared at the ceiling of my luxurious room, listening to the absolute silence of the estate. My brain was a relentless loop of his voice, his heat, and the terrifying realization that I was falling for a man who could legally declare war. Giving up, I slid out of bed. The stone floors were freezing against my bare feet as I crept out of my room, navigating the dark, cavernous halls solely by the faint moonlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I followed the faint hum of refrigeration until I found the industrial kitchens. It was a massive expanse of cold stainless steel, hanging copper pots and dark shadows. I padded over to a glass front pastry case, squinting at the leftover croissants. "The almond ones are stale," I shrieked, spinning around and slapping my hand against my chest. Gideon was sitting in the darkest corner of the room, perched casually on a stainless steel prep counter. He was wearing loose sweatpants and a rumpled t-shirt, his hair sticking up at odd angles. In the dim glow of the refrigerator light, he didn't look like a terrifying king. He just looked like a profoundly exhausted man. "Do you ever sleep?" I hissed, my pulse trying to beat its way out of my throat. "Or do you just hang upside down in a closet until dawn?" "I told you," he rasped, scrubbing a heavy hand over his face. "My mind does not quiet down." All of my defensive energy suddenly drained away. The grand, intimidating estate vanished, leaving just the two of us in the quiet dark. I walked over, grabbed a stale chocolate croissant from the rack, and awkwardly hoisted myself onto the metal counter a few feet away from him. The cold steel seeped through my pajama pants. I ripped the pastry in half and silently held a piece out to him. He looked at the crushed pastry, then at me. Slowly, he took it, his large fingers brushing against mine. The brief contact felt like a static shock. "So," I whispered, the silence of the massive kitchen making my voice sound incredibly loud. "If the border disputes and the trade agreements keep you awake, what are you thinking about right now?" Gideon chewed the stale bread slowly. He swallowed, turning his head to look at me. The exhaustion in his dark eyes had been completely replaced by a heavy, burning intensity. "You," he answered simply. My breath caught. I couldn't deflect. I couldn't crack a joke. I was entirely out of ammunition. He slid off his section of the counter, closing the small distance between us in 2 silent steps. He stepped right between my knees, trapping me against the cold steel edge. His large hands came up, framing my face with a terrifyingly gentle reverence. "I can't," I breathed, my voice breaking. "I don't know how to do this." "Neither do I," he whispered, his thumbs stroking my cheekbones. And then he leaned in, erasing the last fraction of distance between us, and captured my mouth in a desperate, breathtaking kiss. The kiss was a staggering, gravity-defying disaster. It wasn't a disaster because it lacked spark. It had entirely too much spark, melting my higher brain functions into a puddle of useless serotonin, but because daylight brought a brutal, sobering reality check. By 9 in the morning, the midnight vulnerability was completely gone. I was formally summoned to his private administrative suite, escorted by a stone-faced guard who clearly didn't appreciate my jokes about being led to the guillotine. The estate was awake and buzzing with terrifying efficiency. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling glass corridors, illuminating the blooming jasmine and the manicured courtyard below. It was a beautiful tropical paradise, but my stomach was twisting into sickening, complicated knots. The heavy double doors of his office swung open. The room smelled sharply of polished mahogany, old paper, and a suffocating amount of ozone. The air conditioning was cranked so high I instantly shivered, though the sheer, suffocating chill radiating from the man sitting behind the massive desk was infinitely worse. Gideon wore a severe, charcoal gray suit. His broad shoulders were squared, and his jaw was locked so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. He didn't even look up as I awkwardly hovered near the entryway, aggressively twisting the hem of my shirt. "Take a seat," he ordered, his voice completely devoid of the gravelly, desperate warmth from the kitchen. It was flat, clinical, and terrifyingly empty. I didn't move. I prefer standing. It keeps my flight instincts properly primed. He finally lifted his gaze. His dark eyes were calculating and entirely detached. The stoic, untouchable leader was back, efficiently walling off the exhausted, lonely man I had kissed just hours ago. "My security sector has completed the extensive background protocol," Gideon stated smoothly, sliding a sleek black folder across the polished wood. "You are officially cleared of all espionage charges. You are exactly who you claim to be. A wildly underpaid wildlife photographer with a terrible sense of direction," I offered, trying to force a light, breezy laugh. It sounded hollow and pathetic, bouncing off the silent walls. "A civilian," he corrected sharply, leaning forward. "With absolutely no training for the biological volatility or the logistical danger of this territory, this environment is highly unsuitable for your survival." The words felt like a physical, heavy blow to the center of my chest. The air completely rushed out of my lungs. "I have arranged for a secure private transport to take you to the coastal airport," he continued, turning his attention to a glowing tablet, dismissing me with breathtaking efficiency. "Your equipment has already been inventoried. You will be generously compensated for the disruption to your schedule. You are free to go back to your life." My hands turned entirely numb. My deepest, ugliest fear, the paralyzing certainty that I was nothing more than a temporary inconvenience destined to be politely discarded, roared to life. I felt the dangerous, humiliating prickle of tears behind my eyes, but my defensive sarcasm was faster. It always was. "Oh, fantastic!" I chirped, my voice dripping with weaponized, hyper-bright cheerfulness. "I was getting really tired of almost being mauled by your staff anyway." Gideon's hand paused over his tablet. His knuckles went stark, bone-white. "It is the logical solution," he ground out, the muscle in his jaw feathering wildly. "Totally," I agreed aggressively, slapping my palms against the heavy leather of the chair in front of me. "Logic, math, spreadsheets. Why have human emotions when you can just throw money at a hostage and send them packing? It's been an absolute blast, Your Highness. Try not to growl at any more teenagers while I'm gone." I spun on my heel and marched toward the heavy doors, my spine rigidly straight. "Piper," he started, his deep voice cracking just a fraction of an inch. "Cancel my Yelp review," I yelled over my shoulder, refusing to stop or look back. 0 stars. The host was a total nightmare." I slammed the door behind me with earth-shattering force. The satisfying metallic click of my titanium tripod collapsing was the only sound keeping me grounded. I stood in the center of the luxurious guest suite, aggressively throwing my clothes into my canvas duffel bag. I refused to cry. Crying was a vulnerability I simply could not afford. I rolled up a pair of wool socks and hurled them into the bag with enough velocity to shatter glass. Logical solution, I mocked under my breath, viciously zipping a protective lens case. Oh, sure. Kidnap a woman off a freezing mountain, drag her across the country, ruin her sleep schedule, kiss her senseless next to the stale croissants, and then fire her from being a hostage. Very logical, extremely pragmatic. I grabbed my heavy winter coat, aggressively wrestling it into the remaining space of the duffel. My chest ached with a deep, hollow throb. I had let my guard down. I had stopped building pillow forts and barricading doors because, for one incredibly stupid second, I actually thought he was the safe place. Meanwhile, 3 floors up, the absolute silence of the administrative wing was breaking Gideon apart. He paced the length of his sprawling office, his heavy boots thudding rhythmically against the hardwood floor. His pristine logic was failing. The biological, primal instincts he had suppressed all morning were suddenly clawing at the walls of his chest, screaming that a catastrophic error had been made. He ran a heavy hand through his dark hair, entirely ruining the meticulously styled presentation. The ambient noise of the massive estate, the hum of the servers, the distant chatter of the guards, the rush of the water features, felt deafening. The headache, the crushing insomnia that had miraculously vanished the moment she crashed into his chest on the sleeper train, was returning with a violent, sickening vengeance. "Sir?" An aide murmured softly from the doorway, holding a stack of trade agreements. "The council requires your signature." "Not now," Gideon snarled, the low, terrifying vibration rattling the glass of the windows. He strode over to the expansive, floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the sunlit courtyard. His highly tuned vision locked onto a specific, infuriating figure below. It was me. I was marching out the grand front doors, struggling under the immense weight of my overflowing duffel bag, my camera straps completely tangled around my neck. A sleek, black transport vehicle was idling by the fountain, its trunk popped open and waiting. Gideon's breath hitched. He watched as a driver stepped forward to take my bag. He watched me shake my head, stubbornly refusing the help, aggressively shoving the heavy luggage into the trunk myself. I was actually leaving. I wasn't turning around. I wasn't staging a protest. The reality of his logical solution hit him like a freight train. He was protecting her from the chaos of his life, yes, but he was completely destroying himself in the process. Without her biting sarcasm, without her ridiculous defensive maneuvers, the estate was just a quiet, freezing prison. He didn't think. Logic completely evaporated, replaced by a desperate, blinding surge of adrenaline. Gideon turned on his heel, completely ignoring the stunned aide, and bolted out of the office. Down in the blinding sunlight of the courtyard, I aggressively slammed the trunk of the SUV shut. The metallic thud echoed loudly over the bubbling fountain. I adjusted the strap of my camera bag, took a deep, shaky breath of the jasmine-scented air, and reached for the passenger door handle. I just had to get in the car. I just had to drive away. "Piper!" The booming, furious roar echoed across the entire courtyard, completely shattering the quiet morning. I froze, my hand hovering mere inches from the door handle. The nearby gardeners dropped their shears. 2 security guards at the main gate completely abandoned their posts, staring in open-mouthed shock. Gideon burst through the heavy, carved mahogany front doors of the estate like a man escaping a burning building. His charcoal suit jacket was gone. His tie was ripped loose, hanging haphazardly around his neck, and he was sprinting across the manicured gravel with terrifying, predatory speed. He didn't look like an untouchable, pragmatic leader. He looked completely unhinged. I stumbled backward, my heart leaping into my throat. "What are you doing?" He didn't slow down. He closed the massive distance between us in seconds, practically skidding to a halt right beside the transport vehicle. Before I could even blink, he aggressively slammed his large hands against the passenger door, physically trapping me between his chest and the tinted glass of the SUV. "You are not getting in this car," he breathed heavily, his chest heaving, his dark eyes blazing with a frantic, wild energy. "Excuse me?" I yelled, my fight or flight kicking into absolute overdrive. I planted my hands on his solid chest, trying to shove him backward, but he didn't budge an inch. "You literally just evicted me. You fired me from being a hostage. You cleared my background check with a fancy folder." "The background check was a formality," he shouted back, completely abandoning his quiet, stoic volume control. "It was an excuse to keep you here while I calculated the risk assessment." "Risk assessment?" I shrieked, my voice cracking entirely. "Are you out of your mind? You told me I was unsuitable for your environment. You told me to go back to my life, move out of the way before I hit you with a tire iron." "I don't care if you hit me with the entire vehicle," Gideon roared, leaning closer, completely ignoring the fact that 30 members of his elite staff were currently watching their terrifying boss have a public meltdown. "I made a logical miscalculation." "Oh, a miscalculation. Well, let me just update my spreadsheet," I snapped, my eyes burning with frustrated tears that I stubbornly refused to let fall. I shoved at his shoulders again. "Get out of my way, Gideon. You don't get to play the cold, detached king and then sprint into the driveway like a crazy person because you changed your mind." "I did not change my mind," he argued loudly, his hands sliding from the glass of the car to grip my waist, anchoring me in place. "I panicked. You belong in a safe, predictable world. My life is a catastrophic logistical nightmare, and I am terrified that my chaos is going to ruin you." "I don't want a predictable world," I screamed, the absolute raw truth finally tearing out of my throat. "I want the guy who carried me down a freezing mountain. I want the guy who growls at teenagers over luggage. I am terrified that I am going to let myself rely on you, and the second I do, you are going to decide I'm too much of a liability and toss me away." The shouting abruptly ceased. The echo of my confession hung heavily in the thick, sun-drenched air. The courtyard was completely, breathlessly silent. Not a single staff member dared to move. Gideon stared down at me, his chest rising and falling rapidly. The wild panic in his eyes slowly faded, replaced by a profound, earth-shattering realization. He slowly lowered his forehead until it rested gently against mine, completely boxing out the rest of the world. "You are a liability," he whispered roughly, his breath ghosting over my lips. "But if you get in this car, I will never sleep again." His whisper hit me like a physical blow. The absolute vulnerability in his deep voice, the admission that I was the only thing keeping the crushing weight of his insomnia at bay, completely shattered the last remaining brick in my defensive wall. "That's a terrible logistical argument," I mumbled, though the fight had completely drained out of me. My hands, which had been fiercely pushing against his chest, slowly unclenched, my fingers curling into the soft cotton of his ruined shirt. "You're basically saying you want to use me as a human white noise machine." A low, breathless sound escaped his chest, a jagged, rusty laugh that vibrated against my palms. "I am saying," Gideon murmured, his thumb gently tracing the line of my jaw, "that my logic is flawed. My risk assessments are entirely useless when it comes to you. I tried to send you away because I thought it was the right thing to do. It was the most agonizing 20 minutes of my life." He pulled back just enough to look at me, his dark eyes stripped of all their royal pretense. He was just Gideon, messy, exhausted, and desperately trying to fix the disaster he had created. "I am terrified of ruining you, Piper," he confessed softly. "But I am more terrified of this courtyard without you in it." The heavy, suffocating knot of anxiety in my stomach finally unspooled. I looked past his broad shoulders, suddenly hyper-aware of the fact that we were still standing in the middle of a sunlit driveway, completely surrounded by a very silent, very stunned audience of gardeners and security guards. "Well," I whispered, feeling a sudden, hysterical giggle bubble up in my throat. "For someone terrified of ruining me, you're currently causing a massive scene. I think the guy with the hedge clippers is taking notes." Gideon didn't even turn his head. He kept his intense, burning focus entirely on me. "Let them take notes. I do not care." "I care," I hissed, my face suddenly flooding with heat. "You are completely destroying your terrifying reputation. You're the stoic king. You don't yell in driveways." "I am currently yelling in a driveway," he pointed out, a faint, deeply satisfied smirk finally breaking through his exhaustion. He slowly slid his hands from my waist to cup my face. "Piper, tell the driver to cancel the route." I stared into his eyes, searching for the catch, searching for the inevitable trapdoor. But there was nothing there except absolute, unwavering certainty. The frantic need to run away finally completely died. "If I stay," I breathed, my heart hammering violently against my ribs, "I am not building any more pillow forts." "Good," Gideon whispered, "because I am entirely finished staying on my side of the bed." He didn't wait for me to speak to the driver. Gideon reached behind me, aggressively slammed the passenger door of the SUV shut, and turned to the stunned security guard. "Unload her bags. Send them to the primary suite. The guest wing is officially closed." Before I could even process the geographical upgrade, he ducked his shoulder, effortlessly scooped me up, and tossed me over his broad back. "Hey!" I shrieked, laughing as I slapped his solid back. "I can walk! I am a fully functioning adult! Put me down!" "You move too slowly," he argued calmly, marching right past the stunned gardeners and back through the massive mahogany doors of the estate. "And my patience is completely exhausted." The grand foyer blurred past as he carried me up the sweeping, curved staircase. We bypassed the guest corridors entirely, moving deep into the secure, restricted wing of the compound. The air here was cooler, quieter, smelling sharply of cedar and expensive cologne. He didn't stop until we reached a set of heavy, reinforced double doors. He kicked them open, carried me inside, and kicked them shut behind us. The heavy lock engaged with a loud, definitive click. He let my legs slide down his chest until my feet hit the thick, plush rug of his bedroom. The space was massive, dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the valley and a bed that looked large enough to have its own time zone. But I didn't care about the room. I was entirely focused on the sudden, terrifying lack of distance between us. The adrenaline of the courtyard argument vanished, instantly replaced by a heavy, suffocating wave of physical tension. The banter died in my throat. The quiet in the room was absolute, amplified by the heavy thud of my own heartbeat. Gideon stepped into my space, completely erasing the last remaining inches between us. "No more running," he murmured, his hands sliding up my arms to cup my face. His touch was burning hot, completely obliterating the chill of the air conditioning. "No more running," I whispered back, completely surrendering. He didn't hesitate. He captured my mouth in a desperate, bruising kiss that tasted like adrenaline and relief. All the slow-burn tension, all the defensive sarcasm, and the terrified avoidance completely exploded. My hands frantically tangled in his dark hair, pulling him closer as he backed me against the heavy, solid oak of the door. His massive hands were everywhere, urgent and deeply possessive, completely mapping the chaotic, breathless reality that we had finally stopped fighting each other. The blinding, tropical sunlight streaming through the sheer curtains was a violent, unwelcome intrusion. I blinked against the glare, my brain slowly booting up. I was tangled in an absurd amount of high thread count sheets. The mattress was incredibly soft, and there was a heavy, muscular arm draped securely over my waist. The memories of the previous night came rushing back in a dizzying, highly explicit wave. My breath hitched. The vulnerability hangover hit me like a physical blow. The adrenaline was gone, the argument was over. And now I had to do the terrifying morning after talk. I had to face the quiet intimacy of daylight. I had to look at the terrifying alpha king who had completely dismantled my defenses and figure out what happened next. My anxiety spiked into the red zone. I carefully, agonizingly lifted Gideon's heavy arm, holding my breath as I slid out from underneath the covers. He didn't stir. His chest rose and fell in a deep, rhythmic sleep, the first actual, restful sleep I had ever seen him achieve. I grabbed my t-shirt from the floor, yanked it over my head, and wildly scanned the room for an exit strategy. The bedroom door was too far. The hinges might squeak. but the massive first-floor window leading out to the private balcony was wide open, the warm breeze gently rustling the curtains. I snatched my heavy hiking boots from the rug and silently sprinted for the window. I threw one leg over the low sill, mentally calculating the drop to the manicured lawn below. It was totally manageable. I could just take a quick walk, gather my thoughts, avoid the terrifying vulnerability of eye contact for at least an hour. I hoisted my other leg over the sill, aggressively clutching my boots to my chest. Piper. The rough, sleep-heavy gravel of his voice completely froze my blood. I slowly turned my head. Gideon was awake, propped up on one elbow among the tangled sheets. His dark hair was a total disaster, his chest bare, and he was watching me with an expression of profound, highly amused disbelief. "Are you—" he started, rubbing a heavy hand over his face. "Are you currently trying to climb out of my window?" I hovered there, one leg dangling over the manicured hydrangeas, clutching my heavy boots to my chest like a ridiculous leather-bound shield. "I am assessing the structural integrity of the window frame," I lied, my voice painfully high-pitched. "It's very drafty. You should talk to your maintenance sector." A deep, rumbling sound started in Gideon's chest. It wasn't a growl. It was a genuine, full-throated laugh. It completely transformed his face, erasing the last lingering shadows of his exhaustion and making him look devastatingly human. "Come back inside, Piper," he chuckled, the gravel in his voice scraping pleasantly against my nerve endings. "I don't know," I stalled, aggressively tapping my boot against the stucco wall. "If I come back inside, we have to talk about feelings and boundaries and what happens next. It sounds like a logistical nightmare. I might just take a quick jog to the border." He didn't argue. Instead, the bed springs creaked. I heard the soft padding of his bare feet against the rug, and then he was standing directly behind me. The ambient heat of his large frame blanketed my bare shoulders, sending a highly inconvenient shiver down my spine. "If you run to the border," he murmured, wrapping his strong arms loosely around my waist and pulling my back flush against his chest, "I will simply follow you. It seems highly inefficient." "I'm very fast," I threatened weakly, leaning into his solid warmth despite myself. "You have terrible cardio," he corrected smoothly, pressing a warm, lingering kiss to the side of my neck. "Drop the boots, Piper. We are negotiating our terms over breakfast." I let out a long, defeated sigh. The heavy leather boots hit the lawn below with a dull thud. "Fine," I grumbled, letting him pull me backward, tumbling us both onto the plush rug. But I get veto power on any royal decrees. 6 weeks later, the icy mountain ridge felt like a completely different lifetime. "Tilt your chin up!" I shouted over the crashing surf, adjusting the focal length on my massive telephoto lens. "Look majestic! Look like you own the ocean!" The pelican I was currently photographing completely ignored my artistic direction, snapping its massive beak at a passing seagull before diving off the jagged, salt-sprayed rocks. I lowered my camera, groaning as the salty sea breeze whipped my hair across my face. The coastal cliffs of the Southern Territory were blindingly bright, smelling of brine, crushed seashells, and sun-baked earth. It was chaotic, loud, and absolutely perfect. I turned around, wiping a bead of sweat from my forehead. Sitting under a massive canvas umbrella, looking entirely out of place on a brightly striped beach chair, was the alpha king of the Ironwood territory. Gideon was wearing dark sunglasses, a linen shirt completely unbuttoned at the collar, and an expression of profound, unbothered peace. He held a brightly colored, insulated thermos that I knew for a fact contained a blended iced coffee, strictly because I had forced him to try it. He took a slow sip, his dark eyes tracking my movements from behind the tinted lenses. "You're being very unhelpful," I called out, trudging across the sand and dropping my heavy equipment bag near his feet. "You could at least exert some of that terrifying primal authority and tell the wildlife to cooperate?" "I only use my authority for administrative emergencies," he replied lazily, not bothering to sit up. A stubborn pelican does not qualify. You growled at a teenager over a duffel bag 6 weeks ago, I reminded him, planting my hands on my hips. Gideon's mouth twitched into a slow, devastating smirk. That was a matter of national security. I snorted, collapsing onto the edge of his lounge chair. Instantly, his large hand came up, his warm fingers tangling familiarly in my wind-blown hair, gently pulling me back until my shoulders hit his solid chest. The tension that used to permanently knot his muscles was completely gone. He slept through the night now. The dark circles under his eyes had vanished, replaced by a grounded, deeply anchored calm. He wasn't holding his breath anymore. "You look entirely too pleased with yourself," I muttered, leaning my head back against his collarbone, savoring the steady, rhythmic thump of his heart. "Don't you have important, kingly things to do? Spreadsheets to aggressively stare at? Treaties to sign?" "My schedule is perfectly clear," he murmured, his deep voice vibrating against my spine. "My advisory council is handling the afternoon dockets." "They're handling it?" I craned my neck to look up at him, raising an eyebrow. "You actually delegated? The man who wouldn't even let a train conductor book a second cabin is delegating?" Gideon shifted, sliding his arms securely around my waist, anchoring me flush against his side. "I have discovered that my time is better spent supervising my lead photographer. Left to your own devices, you tend to trespass in restricted areas." "I was tracking a rare bird," I defended, laughing as he pressed a quick, warm kiss to my temple. "It was for art. You just lacked creative vision." "I lacked patience," he corrected, his voice dropping into that low, gravelly register that never failed to make my pulse jump. Though I admit, the outcome was highly favorable. "Oh, is that what we're calling it?" I teased, twisting around to fully face him, the coastal wind catching the edge of the canvas umbrella above us. "A highly favorable outcome? That sounds like a quarterly earnings report." Gideon slowly lowered his dark sunglasses, his gaze dropping to my mouth with a heavy, familiar intensity that instantly short-circuited my brain. The background noise of the crashing waves completely faded away. "I can rephrase," he offered softly. I swallowed hard, my defensive instincts completely wonderfully quiet. "You don't have to rephrase. I still think you should have let me keep my original survival equipment. I felt very secure with it." Gideon chuckled, leaning in until the warm, salty air between us vanished entirely. "Piper," he whispered against my lips, "if you ever swing a titanium tripod at my head again, I am throwing it into the ocean."